It really is a pleasure for me to introduce this dazzling duo. What? Why is your hand in your face, Emma? They're here to share some of their expertise. I've gotten to know them a bit over the last year, and certainly Kim and I have shared some laughs and some good times together, as well as shared some stories and some teachings with each other. So thank you very much for your friendship and your grace with that. And let's just get started and have them share some of their experience and expertise with you.
Assalamu alaikum. This is a bit awkward for me to present with my partner, but I'm very honored to be here presenting. I'm gonna begin by doing my comments are introductory remarks, and the meat of the presentation, inshallah, will be Kim because of her clinical practice and expertise. I'm just gonna situate some general questions, inshallah. So, my name is Omar. Assalamu alaikum. Just because of the year and the season that we're in, I'm also going to introduce myself in Anishinaabe. That's my spirit name in Anishinaabe. And the reason I'm doing that is because on Friday, it started on Thursday, but right now there are folks who are sun dancing, and it's important to acknowledge the significance of that. Because my Sundance family told me that they would pray for our community. So I just want to acknowledge that I had the honor of taking our 7-year-old before Jummah. We went to the Sundance grounds and we participated in helping out the Sundancers, and then afterwards we went to Jummah. And it was a very sacred day to be able to start the morning with folks who were for 4 days not eating or drinking for a reason, and we'll get into that, but all these beautiful people coming together to heal, and their modality of healing was fasting, and how that fasting carries them for the year. So I've always wanted to be part of that, and I was honored to be part of that, and I want to acknowledge what they're doing, and I also want you to know that there are people who are praying for us who are not from within our community. It's important to know that there are people who see us, and there are people who are praying for us. And I think it's important for us to think about that as we begin our healing process. But I'll just let Kim introduce herself as well.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Assalamu alaikum. I've seen some familiar faces, which is wonderful. Bonjour. So my traditional indigenous name is White Flower Medicine Woman, and I come from the Wolf Clan. I'm adopted into Peguas First Nations, where I have participated in Sundance and ceremonies for roughly about 15 years. So this is why it's important that we acknowledge the land, the people, the territory that we're on. And regardless of what nation we come from, it's integral that we are doing reconciliation and honoring the indigenous peoples of this land who continue to face ongoing genocide through the political and social and sort of historical ways. So all of us have a duty to that, and I became Muslim 3 years ago, so I am also relatively new. My Muslim name is Selma. So it's beautiful to be able to walk in both worlds. My family really is of Scottish heritage and Viking roots, and then also all nations. We do have Indigenous ancestry as well. So I sort of come with all these intersecting identities, which I absolutely bring into my clinical practice that I do as well. But I'm going to let my husband speak a little bit first, and predominantly we kind of want to start with some macro, meso, micro conversation specifically around addictions. And my husband's going to do sort of the larger macro, and then meso community stuff, and I'm going to talk about the micro, which is the individuals, families, and how that looks working in clinical practice, specifically with adolescents and specifically with addictions.
Yeah, speaking of all nations, just as a sidebar, I did my DNA and found out that I was 17% Viking. I don't know how that works. And I don't, just looking at some family history.
The Vikings were everywhere.
I haven't been told about. I also just want to say it was nice to see some people who I haven't seen in a while. I just want to mention Sharif. Sharif, I hadn't seen Sharif since 1999. We were at McGill together. And I was just reflecting on our time. We did a little bit of a revolution at the MSA, if you recall, right? It was, when I arrived, it was run by these, I don't know what you call them, nameless, faceless Saudi doctors, I guess. And my first week was there, I was told to be the vice president, which I thought was not democratic. So anyway, myself and Sharif and a bunch of folks kind of overthrew that. And it was before 9/11, so we could use words like overthrow in a safe way. So I just want to acknowledge Sharif, and he was a great support for me when I was at McGill, and it was nice to connect with him, inshallah. So I just wanted to start off with that connection. Okay, this is the outline. I'm going to talk a bit about my work. I'm going to give kind of like an introductory conversation about my experiences, and then Kim's going to kind of move into her clinical practice, and we're going to have a conversation a little bit about how we frame the conversation around addictions, but also we're going to talk. I started this talking about connection. And we're going to spend a little time about talking about connections, and you're going to see a little video that kind of, I'm hoping will begin us to have a conversation about maybe we need to shift as a community, because we are navigating a spiritual tradition with our moral code, and now we're moving in as young professionals into societies that are giving us modalities of understanding human experience, and oftentimes we find ourselves trying to understand human experience through the lens of our spirituality, our spiritual tradition, through maybe the Sharia, through our own understanding of our faith tradition, but also through the modalities that we're learning. And sometimes I can tell, I'm a Crown prosecutor, I've been prosecuting for 22 years now. That hits me very, very much, coming from a tradition that talks about justice, then walking into a justice system and thinking, how do I make decisions like the Prophet would? How do I look at the world around me, and particularly our community, which is facing incredible challenges? I was just sharing with folks, the level of violence that we're witnessing from folks who really have no commitment to the social contract in ways that, and I usually use the pandemic as a demarker. Before the pandemic in the justice system, we were, addressing issues which, it was like, okay, some little bit of support, someone fell through the safety net. There was still horrible stuff happening, don't get me wrong, but the frontline stuff, a lot of it was, okay, are we really going to prosecute someone for stealing baby formula? Are we really going to prosecute someone for assault a police officer with a weapon when the weapon was a bag of chips and they're running away from the 7-Eleven? A lot of it we were cleaning up and trying to get stuff out of the justice system for folks who just needed that little bit of help. And now post-pandemic, and we can talk about a little of this, that those folks are still there, but the level of violence that we're seeing from folks who they need help, but they are an incredible threat to themselves and society around them. How do we navigate that? How do we think about that? And then again, as a Muslim community, because our obligations aren't just to ourselves. When the Prophet ﷺ talks about wanting for your neighbor what you want for yourself, and you're not a believer if your neighbor goes to bed hungry, or your neighbor is in need, if you go to the meaning of what was being talked about, we have an obligation, right? And all of us are going into these different fields, maybe perhaps guided by that obligation. I know I wanted to go into med school, but it was a scholar who told me if you want to change society, it was the social scientists and the lawyers and the teachers who laid the foundation of a community that was based on adl, that was based on justice, right? And so that inspired me. But oftentimes we might get lost in the day-to-day of what we do. So constantly bringing it back to spirit, bringing it back to why we do things in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the previous presentations talking about something very practical as human relationships with the Imam, he kept on saying, what is our responsibility vis-a-vis our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So that's kind of, what are the kinds of conversations we're happening, and particularly as we see what's happening. So just to give you a bit of a background, we've been running a basketball program here in the inner city for Muslim youth since 2000. I always lose it. I think it's 2012, I should say, sorry. And all of it started because there was a young brother I knew. He knew his family. I knew when they came here as refugees. His name was Muhammad Omar. He was gunned down in a gang shooting outside the Maryland Hotel. If you're familiar with the city, you know exactly where that is roughly. And that was, that impacted me. And then there was another incident I was remembering last night. There was a young brother who came to me after the masjid. He was saying, "Brother, I need to talk to you. I'm having some issues." And it's, you know, it's always, you never know once you give a chutzpah whether someone wants to tell you how much they hate you, or whether or not, you know, it's just going to be a conversation, you know, your pronunciation was, this is kind of where we were. I'm so used to people just, you know, not genuinely reaching out for help, but just taking the opportunity to, you know, criticize you or whatever the case is. But it was a young brother, he said he had problems, he wanted to talk to me. I was like, oh, okay, well, let's talk. And then a week later, I had read an article in the paper that he had taken his life. And I thought, you know, what was that moment? Was there a moment that was presented to me that I didn't take? When Muhammad Umar was shot, I knew him regularly. We played soccer together. He was at the masjid. And so this conversation, because up until then, I would suggest that these kinds of issues that our youth were facing were identified in spiritual lens. You know, oh, they just want to party. You know, they just want to go out. But these were folks who confront reality. These were masjid goers. These were folks from traditions that, you know, have been Muslim since, you know, Islam first came to their continent. We're not talking about folks on the peripheries. And so that began me to think. And so we started up this basketball program, and we've gone through like 3 or 4, I don't know, let's see, generations, but, you know, the folks who started the program are now in their late 20s, and then we have young folks coming in, predominantly racialized, predominantly from the inner city, predominantly Muslim. The program is open to absolutely everybody. It was interesting watching the program. So, you know, all these guys would come, they felt comfortable, right? So they would come to the program, I'd see them in the masjid, and then, you know, their friends would all line up on the side and watch them and catcall them and stuff like that. So, you know, I'm watching this and I'm like, these are folks who would never want their parents to see this, right? But they're good people and they're just happy to be there and they're safe, right? This was a time when there was a gang particularly attracting young Muslims, and I was a young prosecutor. And I remember going to court. It was a different time. I was at a time when I was enforcing drug prosecution, so I was very, you know, shooting, I don't know how else to say it, and these young men would come in and I'd look at them and I'd just be all like, you know what, I don't know how to get back at you about how embarrassed I am about the fact that we share the same religious faith, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pronounce your name in court precisely the way it's supposed to be, right? So, you know, you'd have like my white colleagues who would be like, Abdul or whatever, and then I'd be all like, Your Honor, I think Abdul Fattah should not be released from jail, right? And I'd watch their faces and they'd be all like, you know, oh, this guy's one of us, man, what the heck? But I would spend time and I'd look through the names, because one time when we'd release folks, we don't want them connecting with other gang members. Like, we're talking about 20 names, beautiful names. Names of Sahaba, names that invoke the Asma al-Husna, right? And again, but the people themselves, we're not talking about folks who necessarily are marginalized. We're not talking about folks who don't know the faith. I encourage you to go online and look at some of the people who talk about folks who've fallen into these, who are struggling with substance use or are in gangs. And she says that these are the future awliya. These are people who have incredible gifts, the ability to connect with people, the ability just to recruit, the ability to see things and see the world in a different way. And so I began to think, I'm like, okay, this can't be the approach. It can't be the approach that we keep telling people, you know, don't do drugs. They know that. This can't be the approach, you need to come to the masjid. They're in the masjid. It can't be the approach just to tell them they're here. They're doing all these things. And I just began to think about, you know, what is it that's happening? And it came full circle again. I started the ball program. There was a young brother who was with us from the very start of the program in 2012. And, you know, I got to know him well. And he would share with me, I'm like, yo, you guys, whenever you come, you're so like, you know, your energy, you're so relaxed. Only once at a time. Only once I had to call the gang unit because someone said they had a gun, but they didn't. It was only once. Like, that was great. Like, you know, he's like, brother, it's because we were all high before the program. We would all smoke weed before we came out. I'm like, oh, okay, good to know. Okay, yeah. And again, these are not folks on the periphery. And I was listening to him. And then I found out he passed away. His parents found him in the basement. I have forgiveness on it. And what again hit me about that is he started the program with us. He was always there. He fell into some difficulty. And I heard from one of the imams who was visiting him, oh, he was asking for you. And I got mad. And I said to the imam, why did you tell me? Like, what was stopping you? Oh, he said you were his best friend and he was asking for you. Then I thought again. So there was an attempt at an intervention, but did it work? And I remember meeting his dad, and again, this hit me again, and beautiful brother, beautiful family. And he says, I know my son had some struggles, and we went out and we attempted to get him help, and he found a program that worked for him. We funded it, we drove him outside the city, we took him there, and he said to me, he brought all his stuff, and he said, okay, Dad, just wait, if I don't come back, that means it's good. The program works for me. 10 minutes he came back, and he said, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he said, they want me to accept Jesus. SubhanAllah. And he implored, I went with my mom, he implored us. He said, can you please set up programs for Muslims? And they feel culturally safe. They don't feel like they're trying to be converted. They don't feel like it's not going to work for them. And again, that hit me very hard. What is our community facing? How are we navigating these things? And are we actually succeeding in helping our children, subhanAllah? Because that's an incredible responsibility. I set up the ball program for these young men, but there it is, like, it wasn't just the use, like, one brother, in some ways it was the one brother who came, he had just the worst, bloodiest knuckles. It's a guy I knew from the masjid for a long time, he wouldn't tell me what happened, and one of their other brothers said, he got drunk last night and he got angry at a tree. So he decided to take out his anger on the tree. Okay, I didn't know he drank. And again, the default is, astaghfirullah, why does he drink? But then I'm like, well, what are we doing? He didn't feel comfortable talking to me about that. What they did feel comfortable talking about was when the police were going to come in to get them. I had brothers calling me, literally, like they're hiding under their beds. Saying, Omar, Sheikh, they just call me Sheikh Omar, I don't know why. I'm not a Sheikh. Omar, the police are coming to get me. I'm like, okay, like, why? Oh, I lent my car to my friend and they robbed a store. I find this funny. And I'm like, so why are they coming for you? If they, what's that?
Survival humor.
Yeah. Why are they coming for you? I was like, well, I might have been in the car. Oh, man. But the fact of the matter is that, and then they'd come to me the next day saying I was driving around last night when my friends pulled out a sawed-off shotgun, and very real. I'm like, that if the police were to have caught you, you'd go to jail for 3 years. 3 years is the starting for possession of a prohibited, restricted, loaded firearm. That's 3 years of your life in the penitentiary. And because you're racialized, you're not getting early release. You're not getting out after 1/6. You may not even get out after 2/3. You may have to serve the rest of your sentence in a penitentiary. And then I kind of stopped, like, they probably know this. Why am I? But so again, what is happening? Why aren't we able to communicate with the folks around us, even when they open up? And it made me realize that, maybe we need to shift how we talk. There's a palpable disconnect, right? And the intersections between the different Muslim communities, right? Just look at the masjid. How many folks come from places where they've seen people die? You ever think about that, right? One of the most graphic stories I was ever told was from a young Kosovan boy, and I was younger. I was working just with, learning. Yeah, there's no children here, are there? So this is a trigger warning.
Yeah, trigger warning.
About a very graphic. Does anybody have? I don't have to talk about it. If is anyone going to be re-traumatized by me talking about a very graphic incident? No. Okay.
You can leave if it is.
Yeah, and I'm only sharing this with you because of, just so we know what it is our young people are going through. I'm not going to go into the details. He witnessed a horrible graphic incident on his grandfather, and he shared that, and it came out, and and now let's just jump forward again to the justice system. I'm seeing folks and continue to see folks in the justice system who have this same kind of trauma. Okay, and their human reaction has been to self-harm. Their human reaction has been to use substances. Their human reaction has been to lash out and to become criminalized. And when I began to see the patterns in the justice system, I felt like I was reading about people in our community, people with the same experiences. And yet I was able in my, a drug treatment court, which is a program where you put folks in, rather than going to the pen, they do treatment for 2 years, or mental health court, folks who have significant mental health issues, usually Access 1. If they've committed crimes, rather than going to jail, they do 2 years of pharmacological intervention. Access 2 is a bit more difficult to navigate. And when I was looking at people in the justice system, I could be like, oh, come on, this person needs help. At some point, we can't help you. If you hurt someone so much, horribly, violently, defy their dignity, I can't help you. You're going to jail. We're going to remove you from society. I don't care. That's just how I work. But between that, we're talking, that's usually the top few percent. Between that are folks who just fell between the cracks. And then I began to realize that this lens is not the lens I see when I walk into the community from the pulpit. I don't see, why is there this, do we do that in our own lives? That we have clients who were able to talk about harm reduction, we're able to talk about minimizing their use, we're about talking about, okay, let's meet you where you're at. But when it comes to our community and our tradition, we struggle with that. I can tell you I did. It was a realization at some point of I'm showing so much grace to people based on just what they've gone through, and yet people in my community have gone through the same thing. How much grace are we showing? How are we connecting with them? How are we helping? And that was a big realization for me. I just so the realization that, the kids that I was working with, they're using, and they're talking to each other about that. And I don't know who else they're talking to. They're being involved in criminality, but they're still part of the community, and sometimes they reach out for help. How do I understand what it is they're going through? How do I understand the choices they're making? How do I even understand, the use in what they're doing? And at this point, I'm just gonna turn to Kim, because she's done this kind of clinical practice, and this is kind of how we set it up, that I would sort of present these kinds of questions and struggles that I was facing with, and I'm sure a lot of you went through, and then she'll address it from her clinical practice perspective.
Ron, I don't have a clicker, so next slide. Okay. I just want to acknowledge my husband and the incredible work that he does in the community. I also just want to acknowledge my mother-in-law, who founded Islamic Social Services, and that's the reason all of you are gathered here today. And the incredible work that ISA does in Winnipeg and Manitoba specifically. And I think my mother-in-law, one of her legacies is that she builds bridges between communities and brings people together to have conversations that are integral. And ISA is so close to my heart. I do some work for ISA, and they graciously let me use a space there for my clinical practice, which I'm really thankful for. Sam does so lovely, and all the staff at ISA who graciously welcome. My clients feel so welcome in the space, and that says a lot. My clients are predominantly First Nation, Indigenous, non-status Métis. Because I'm a FNIB provider, so I bill direct to the federal government to see Indigenous clients. I also have a caseload of some ISA clients, so some Muslim clients, and predominantly over half of my caseload, I travel to reserve as well, is youth and adolescents. So, and when I use that term, what I'm talking about is sort of the federal definition, which is ages 12 to 24. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this demographic. I'm also going to just give a little bit of history about my journey as a social worker. So I started my journey in community health. I was a program manager for a program called Sage House, which runs out of Mount Carmel Clinic. For about 5 years I worked there, and that program was essentially a safe injection site. So I learned so much about drugs and alcohol and people involved in the peripheral of society, so the intersecting identities, lots about harm reduction approaches. So I'm going to talk a little bit and a lot about the youth brain specifically, and why this age group is very, very vulnerable to developing addictions, and how we can build that resiliency to help our adolescents who are navigating a world that is actually very unkind to them. So we're going to sort of hopefully tie it all together. Next slide there. You're doing great. Come on. Okay, so all of the developmental aspects of the youth come, for my work at least. I love Dr. Dan Siegel. He is a fabulous researcher. He's a adolescence and pediatric psychiatrist. He does a ton of research on the brain, developmental stages. He has written the book, The Whole Brain Child, No Trauma Discipline. This is fabulous resource for parents. I'm sorry, I'm tall. I'm gonna push this. No disrespect to all my smaller relatives. Auntie. I highly recommend him. He's fabulous. And he has done incredible research on the adolescent brain. And I'm going to use his acronym that he uses. And if anything you can take away from today, it's that acronym about how to work with youth. So again, the reason we use sort of 12 to 24 is because that is when the brain is developing and changing so much. So I have written the acronym ESSENCE over there on the wall. So it's sort of a cheat sheet, so you can all remember sort of the key aspects of when working with youth or who have youth in your lives, adolescents in your lives. I'm using those terms interchangeably. So ES stands for emotional spark. This age demographic is full of intense emotions. And the reason that this is, sort of developmentally and evolutionary wise, Dr. Dan Siegel talks about this in his book, is because the brain is getting prepared to move away and become autonomous, build your own family, build your own network. And when you flood the brain with emotions, it forces motion. Emotions are energy in motion. Okay, so if you can remember sort of like this is why we overflood, because we want the youth, the adolescent, to start to move. Otherwise, they're going to stay at home forever, which is not a bad thing. In some cultures, that's very celebrated, but they need to develop their own sense of autonomy. They need to develop their own sense of individuation, their own gifts, their own social networks. This is all developmentally normal. But now what we know, sort of doing a deep dive into the research about the brain, is that the limbic system and the right hemisphere of the brain, which processes emotions are also stored in the body, is that for youth, if the normal baseline for you and I is a developed, I'm assuming for those who are over 25, if our baseline is here for emotional fluctuation, meaning here's the bottom, here's the top, and this is sort of normal for all of us. We have good days, we have bad, we have, that's sort of what we do. For youth, it's this. The top is higher and the bottom is lower, which means that their emotions are doing this, higher and lower, which means that when they're feeling good, they're feeling really good. They feel awesome. And this is where you get the 3 a.m. sparks of hey mom, I had this brilliant idea, and they want to talk, it's late at night, you're like, what's happening? So, and then the lows though can be super low. So this is really important when working with youth because they tend to already be doing this a little bit. So emotional spark, what are the gifts of this? Youth, adolescence, the essence of adolescence, full of passion. And that is something that we want to take with us into even our adult lives. Passion is beautiful. Where can the pitfalls be? Well, if you're swinging like this, that can be exhausting. It can be scary, and it can be overwhelming. And then you can make sometimes not great choices because when we're up or down, really low. So yeah, that's ES. So the first part of essence is emotional spark. There we go, I'm running. Okay. The SE stands for social exploration or engagement. So this stage and age, kids are pushing against the status quo. And developmentally, that is normal. And actually across cultures, although this may manifest in different ways, it's actually normal. So when the grandmother is like, we make tea this way, the youth is going to be like, well, I'm going to do it a different way. I'm gonna try it just cause, right? That's normal. And again, evolutionary wise, that is because we're getting ready to be autonomous. We're getting ready to individuate, create our own families, find our own way. So the positives of this, kids tend to run to their peers more at this age. And they're looking for that ability to create relationships outside of their family, which from an evolutionary perspective is actually a good thing, because when we're adults, we need lots of different social connections, networks, friendships to help us live our best lives, to help keep our families healthy and vibrant. It's actually really good. What are the downsides? Well, because youth are pushing against the status quo, they tend to not want to listen to their caregivers, right? They tend to not want to. They're like, just because my mom said it doesn't mean it's like, this is the like classic, like, why? I don't buy it. All you adults in your traditional way of living, you all seem miserable. The world is blowing itself up. Why should I listen to you? Yeah, I see some heads nodding. Okay, we're familiar with this, okay? Developmentally normal. And actually, in many of our cultures and traditions, there was built-in safety nets for this age and stage. And I'm gonna get into that a little bit later. So this is normal, right? This pushing against the status quo. If you tell a youth not to do something, because of the way that their brain is evolving, they're gonna do it. Push against the status quo. Normal part of development, right? Carry that ability to develop social networks, the ability to develop relationships into their adult life. That's going to serve them well. Where it can be dangerous is when we trade morality for membership with our youth and our peers. Okay, here we go. N for the essence is novelty. So youth, the adolescent brain loves novelty. So that means anything that's new, anything that's different, they love it, their brain loves it. And why? Because it creates dopamine in the brain. So when we think about the youth who's already swinging, they're swinging high and low. If you give them something that creates dopamine, it actually swings them higher. So even for those of us who love sugary foods, that's a dopamine enhancing. We love our sugary foods. For youth, it's even more. They feel that even more. So this is where we get into some like risky, like if they start to take drugs, alcohol at this age, the highs are even more than like the average adult, right? But then so is the low. So these are really important things to keep in mind when working with youth. Novelty-seeking behavior. This is that I'm gonna run off the roof because it feels fun. Isn't this a great idea? Let's run off the roof, right? The ability to do executive functioning, which is the ability to like follow a thought to the very end and the consequences, is not fully developed yet. Let's steal a car. That's a great idea. That'll be fun. They're seeking, peer membership. They're novelty seeking. So in his book, Dr. Dan Siegel talks about embracing the need for novelty, but doing it in a safer way. So that the child, the youth, the adolescent is not harming themselves or others, right? So N is for novelty. The last two letters, here we go. Thanks, Imran, you're doing great. Creative exploration. The youth mind is full of amazing capacities to problem solve. This is why I love working with this age group, because they're just like on fire for ideas, for passions. They're pushing against the status quo and they're like, I don't buy it. This world, and then you're like, what are your ideas? And they have so many, right? And in his book, he talks about like, our world is in trouble. Climate change, war, starvation, all of what's happening to our earth, what's happening. We need all the creative minds, problem-solving capacity that we can possibly get our hands on. So, I'm a big advocate of working with the gifts that this age and stage come with, But are there risks? Absolutely. And often the youth that I sit with, they feel very stifled by the adults in their life who don't want to listen to them because of their creative ideas, or sometimes a little bit out there. But often they get stifled by parents, teachers, coaches. The adults in their lives don't want to listen to them. So that's really important. Okay, I'm going to talk specifically about, I feel like I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to try to talk as fast as I can because you're probably all hungry. So how this relates specifically to addictions, right? We talk about sort of like the swings for youth and what that can do. So this is an age and stage. They're pushing against the status quo. They're seeking dopamine. They're seeking approval from their peers, coupled with their creativity not always being celebrated. This makes them very high risk for developing an addiction. And then when we look at Muslim youth specifically, you add all that other developmental stuff that they're going through, and you look at the larger social context. What are they navigating? They're navigating identity crisis, sometimes orientation crisis. They're navigating facing being bullied, facing racism. And racism from the micro, meso, macro levels. They're facing racism in their schools. They're facing racism when they interface with the hospital system. They're facing racism when they interface with the police. They're also watching sort of federally, politically, what's happening. And that is really difficult when you look at all the things they're already navigating. Now they have to navigate a world that is essentially unsafe. And they also, many of the youth I sit with, be like, please don't tell my parents. Please don't tell my parents. So they're walking with all of this without anybody to talk to, except their peers. So the other thing I want to talk about a little bit, and I'm talking specifically about in Canadian Western culture, so capitalistic colonial culture, our age and stage for adolescence has prolonged. So, 100 years ago, puberty would have hit around 16, and then the individual would have been married, having kids around 18. So it's like 2 years of that adolescent period. Now, because of the way our culture is set up and because puberty is earlier, we think that's something to do with the nutrition, globalization of our nutritional food. The onset is earlier, and then the prolonged period is now into the mid-20s. So that period of development is now longer, and now we also have an oversaturation for our adolescents of information. In the past, the information that's now available to our youth would have been available in a lifetime. Now they are navigating all of this stuff because of social media, because of internet, in 5 minutes. What previous, like 50 years ago, adolescents would have navigated in their lifetime. So what are we seeing? We're seeing youth who are overwhelmed. They're entering this stage of pushing against the status quo, and they're looking at the world that they're going to have to inherit, and they're going, wow, this is terrifying. And it is terrifying, and it's overwhelming, and it's scary. Okay, so I'm trying to paint sort of the larger adolescent context. So there's the essence of adolescence, and in the book he talks a lot about like working with the gifts of this age. And if you're going to work with youth, you have beautiful adolescents in your life. I try to tell the adults and the parents I work with as well, take the essence of adolescence into your life as well. Because our lives are better when we're actually doing novelty, when we're engaged in creative exploration, when we feel passionate about things, and where we're exploring our social networks, right, in a different way. Those are beautiful gifts. So I want to back up really quickly and just talk about addictions for a moment. And there's lots of different models of how to approach addictions. So there's the medical model, which believes that our addiction is a disease, and that it is a chemical dependency that formulates in the brain. I work now with the Manitoba Detox Center. I'm there every 2 weeks, and I'm working with folks who are actively like coming off of substances, and some of them are adolescents as well. So there's also the psychological model, which believes that addictions are formed because of trauma, and that people develop addictions to sort of cope with a dysregulated nervous system. There's a sociological model, which sort of takes the approach of like, well, why are some addictions, legalized and some are not? And usually it's connected to political, socioeconomic reasons. So I'm going to guess, if I asked all of you to take a 4-hour break from your phone, that you wouldn't be able to do it. I'm sorry, but a lot of you are probably addicted to your phones, myself included. So we all have addictions. Why are some culturally, socially, politically acceptable and some are not, right? Illegal substances not acceptable, but somehow it's okay. It's okay to have an addiction to maybe like prescription medication or your phone or social media, food, right? Okay, so that's sort of the sociological model. They look at why is that? Why do we demonize some addictions and why are some acceptable? There's the morality model, which is that if people who have addictions are just morally weak, and that they need to foster a better sense of, morality, and then they'll be able to get over their addiction. And then there's the biopsychosocial model, which is a little bit of a blend of all of those models, but they tend to look at the individual, tend to look at the social context, also tend to look at the trauma, everything all in one, and tend to hold space that possibly addictions are complex. Most of the programs here in Winnipeg are disease-based models. There's some legal models as well. And then there's also biopsychosocial models. Okay, I have a video here. I'm hoping Ron can pull it up. This is just one of my favorite sort of takes on addiction. Yeah, hopefully it'll work.
What causes, say, heroin addiction? This is a really stupid question, right? It's obvious, we all know it. Heroin causes heroin addiction. Here's how it works. If you use heroin for 20 days, by day 21, your body would physically crave the drug ferociously because there are chemical hooks in the drug. That's what addiction means. But there's a catch. Almost everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. If you, for example, break your hip, you'll be taken to a hospital and you'll be given loads of diamorphine for weeks or even months. Diamorphine is heroin. It's in fact much stronger heroin than any addict can get on the street because it's not contaminated by all the stuff drug dealers dilute it with. There are people near you being given loads of deluxe heroin in hospitals right now, so at least some of them should become addicts. But this has been closely studied. It doesn't happen. Your grandmother wasn't turned into a junkie by her hip replacement. Why is that? Our current theory of addiction comes in part from a series of experiments that were carried out earlier in the 20th century. The experiment is simple. You take a rat and put it in a cage with 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with heroin or cocaine. Almost every time you run this experiment, the rat will become obsessed with the drugged water and keep coming back for more and more until it kills itself. But in the 1970s, Bruce Alexander, a professor of psychology, noticed something odd about this experiment. The rat is put in the cage all alone. It has nothing to do but take the drugs. What would happen, he wondered, if we tried this differently? So he built Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats. It's a lush cage where the rats would have colored balls, tunnels to scamper down, plenty of friends to play with, and they could have loads of sex. Everything a rat about town could want. And they would have the drugged water and the normal water bottles. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, rats hardly ever use the drugged water. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. But maybe this is a quirk of rats, right? Well, helpfully, there was a human experiment along the same lines, the Vietnam War. 20% of American troops in Vietnam were using a lot of heroin. People back home were really panicked because they thought there would be hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war was over. But a study followed the soldiers home and found something striking. They didn't go to rehab. They didn't even go into withdrawal. 95% of them just stopped after they got home. If you believe the old theory of addiction, that makes no sense. But if you believe Professor Alexander's theory, it makes perfect sense. Because if you're put into a horrific jungle in a foreign country where you don't want to be, and you could be forced to kill or die at any moment, doing heroin is a great way to spend your time. But if you go back to your nice home with your friends and your family, it's the equivalent of being taken out of that first cage and put into a human rat park. It's not the chemicals, it's your cage. We need to think about addiction differently. Human beings have an innate need to bond and connect. When we are happy and healthy, we will bond with the people around us. But when we can't, because we're traumatized, isolated, or beaten down by life, we will bond with something that gives us some sense of relief. It might be endlessly checking a smartphone, it might be pornography, video games, Reddit, gambling, or it might be cocaine. But we will bond with something because that is our human nature. The path out of unhealthy bonds is to form healthy bonds, to be connected to people you want to be present with. Addiction is just one symptom of the crisis of disconnection that's happening all around us. We all feel it. Since the 1950s, the average number of close friends an American has been steadily declining. At the same time, the amount of floor space in their homes has been steadily increasing. To choose floor space over friends, to choose stuff over connection. The war on drugs we've been fighting for almost a century now has made everything worse. Instead of helping people heal and getting their life together, we have cast them out from society. We have made it harder for them to get jobs and become stable. We take benefits and support away from them if we catch them with drugs. We throw them in prison cells, which are literally cages. We put people who are not well in a situation that makes them feel worse and hate them for not recovering. For too long, we've talked only about individual recovery from addiction. But we need now to talk about social recovery, because something has gone wrong with us as a group. We have to build a society that looks a lot more like Rat Park and a lot less like those isolated cages. We are going to have to change the unnatural way we live and rediscover each other. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Thank you, Emma. Okay, so that is my favorite model, and the model that I base my clinical practice around is that folks that use substances, and especially our adolescents that use substances, they're looking for connections. They're looking for connections socially, they're looking to feel better, they're all those reasons. So specifically just, some consequences when we're not able to have open talks about drugs and alcohol and any substance or addictions, really, because it's not just drugs, it is pornography, it's screens, it's gambling, it's all of those things. But obviously when we're not able to talk about it with our adolescents about these things, they're at high risk for getting a communicable disease, so hepatitis C, HIV, syphilis. There's legal consequences. There's the mental health struggles that come along with substance use. So because of the ups and downs and the highs and lows, they tend to, when they're really high, especially when they're using dopamine-inducing drugs, they tend to drop even lower than they would. Okay, I got 5 minutes. There's disordered eating. There's the impact on the brain at this age because their brain is developing so much. There is there's an impact on their brain when they chronically use substances that is sometimes irreversible into adulthood. There's a tendency to self-harm, and then there's also a suicide or overdose risk. Okay, so in my clinical practice, if I were to because youth are pushing against the status quo, I never tell a youth not to do something. I listen, and then there's so much research now to show that there are receptors, literally neuroreceptors around our heart and our gut, and that is some of the only way to get a youth to actually think through their actions is to get them to listen to their own inner intuition. And that's actually formed in childhood with a strong, guardian who's providing all the 4 S's of secure attachment, which I put over here. That's formed in childhood. And so at that stage where they're pushing against the status quo and they no longer want to listen to the caregiver, they will listen to their own intuition. And so getting them to build that relationship with their body, with their own intuition. When I'm in session with an adolescent and they're telling me about their drug use, they're telling me about their friends who are drug dealers and wanting to rope them into that life. When we push all that aside and I'm like, listen to your gut, what is it telling you? And they're like, not to do it. 9 times out of 10, their gut is bang on. Right? And so I'm sorry, the shoulding does not work for this age group. In fact, it makes it worse and they push harder. So like trying to just work with their inner intuition, so important. I also, in my clinical practice, I get really comfortable talking about drugs. So ish, down, Molly, moonshine, weed, all of it. I know how and I ask a ton of questions. Where are you getting it? Who's selling it to you? How are you getting money to sell? How are you using it? Are you smoking it? Are you injecting it? I had a youth just tell me they were making their makeshift pipes with pop cans. And I'm like, please don't, again, I'm like, never should. I'm like, okay, let's walk through the pros and cons of doing that. Let's walk through the pros and cons of making a pipe with a pop can and smoking your ish that way. Let's do the pros and cons. And then, did you know that you can get a bubble pipe from the health center here? No, I didn't know that. Okay, if you absolutely need to use, let's make sure you're using safely, right? In ways that reduce harm, right? And build their capacity to listen to their own gut, their own intuition. And I know I'm super close to being cut off here, but I just want to talk about naloxone briefly. Naloxone saves lives. This is available in all communities, most community health centers, wherever you're from. They give these out for free. This reduces the impact of opiates. So a lot of the overdoses that we're seeing specifically in Winnipeg are fentanyl-based overdoses. So opiates stop the heart, and you have no idea how much they're lacing fentanyl and so many other drugs in this city. And I know this is across the country, this is the case. So I would really encourage, all of you to think about how to make sure this is in families' homes for folks that are using substances. It is overdose is so preventable. It's so preventable. So, this, and then I also just keep a pulse on sort of what's happening. We have some great resources in Winnipeg, Street Connections being one of them. I just check their website regularly to look at, they put out drug alerts. Right now in the city, we're seeing a mix of benzodiazepines and fentanyl in a powder-based substance. Now, when that happens, naloxone doesn't work on benzos, but it does work on the opiates. So they're having to do 4 or 5 naloxone shots to reverse the impact of the overdose. Dangerous. It's super dangerous. So I will also walk through with my adolescents who are using substances just around sort of drug safety. In our own communities, because many of us come from traditional cultures and societies, built-in safety nets for our adolescents were to have adults in their lives who could step in when they're pushing against the parents. So this was aunties, cousins, uncles, and those relatives having those relationships in your lives when your kids aren't, ready to listen to you. But if they're willing to sit with and talk with and have mentors, other adults who are good, have your best, adolescent's purpose in mind, those are hard to find sometimes. So we definitely need to build that capacity, especially for folks who are coming here and they don't trust. And not everyone in our communities walks in a good way. So, and then I didn't really get to talk about how our spiritual traditions actually build resilience in our youth as well. Ability to handle distress, emotions, trauma is so much built into the spirituality. Fasting is a fabulous way to build distress tolerance. So when I talk about distress tolerance, ability to navigate sadness, anger, all the big emotions, right? They're swinging big. So any emotional regulation, any ability to sit in that and move through it and realize that they're okay on the other side, so imperative, so important. Okay, and then obviously talking about drugs, access to naloxone. Okay, you come say anything. I think we're talking about that.
So just on that last note, I think as a community we really need to always go back to the Sunnah and our tradition. I will never tell anyone of us to abandon our spiritual code. but the spiritual code is universal, and it's for all time. And particularly this conversation, and I just want to use fasting as an example, the ability to sit in discomfort. Oftentimes, the reaching for other substances, whether it's illicit narcotics or it's something out there, we are conditioned as human beings in this society to reach outside to satisfy some discomfort within us. I really want us sometimes to go back to the basics and think about the significance of what it's like just to sit there and be uncomfortable. And that's a commandment from Allah. What is Allah teaching us? What is Allah sharing with us? And I go back to the Sundance now. A lot of the folks are just fasting so they can learn how to navigate life. I think it's really important. And this conversation about, isn't that video amazing? And it's amazing also because it's telling us what our Prophet told us. It's telling us what the Quran tells us. It's telling us to stay connected with each other and how that connection. And if our community is facing these things, then we need to reevaluate our understanding of what it is to be in a community. Have we limited it to the Jamaat? We say salam to people on each side of us and then that's it? Or do we really understand what a community is, right? And if we're not able to do that in the confines of the masajid, because the masajid have their own tumultuous political situations going on, why don't we recreate those spaces? Why don't we create spaces where people feel connected, right? And I think that's a lot of the work that the Islamic Social Services is doing. But I just encourage us to really think about that and founding our relationships and our models on the prophetic model, which is all about our hearts connecting with each other. But also, let us not forget our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that is also the fundamental connection, right? And so don't dismiss these things. All of these things come down to the basics of our tradition and our spiritual teaching. So I just wanted to end with that. Thank you.